9:08 in the morning here at KVMR. That the SNCC Freedom Singers led by Emory Harris, and We'll Never Turn Back. And joining us in studio for what I think will be a very interesting discussion this morning, Bill Drake, formerly working here at KVMR, now over at the over the co-op, I believe.
Yeah, that's right, Steve.
And we are also joined by Reverend Lou Powell. Welcome to KVMR this morning, sir.
Good morning, Steve.
And also Jamal Walker, who I think is also known on the blues scene, if I'm correct.
Well, just a little bit here locally. Yeah.
All right.
Good morning.
And I guess maybe I'll just turn it over to you, Bill, just to sort of kick things off. We're going to have a discussion of a topic that a lot of folks don't talk about. It's called racism.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And it's real nice to be back at KVMR. I worked here for 8 years some time back, and it's real nice to be back in the studio. It feels good. The three of us each have really different backgrounds that each one tells a different story, so we're going to each go through our experiences growing up as young people. My own background was growing up in Norfolk, Virginia. I was born in 1945, so I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s. So I'm going to talk about what it was like for me as a white kid growing up in a white world within the racist society that existed in the South and in my hometown. For myself, part of the story of my history as well as part of the story of racism in the South is a combination of two elements. One is history. There's a whole history with the South and with racism in this country that built on itself over a long period of time. And then during the time of the 50s and 60s, and certainly before and after that, you have the climate that existed, the climate of segregation, which led, of course, to the civil rights struggle, which went on for a long time before Martin Luther King, but certainly became more known at the time of Martin Luther King. So there was a whole history that was involved, and interwoven within that was a climate that was created out of that history, a climate of separation of races, a climate of white superiority. And the history of white superiority goes back certainly in this country to the founding of the country, so it's throughout the whole history. For myself, the history came to me through my birth lineage, in particular through my mother, who was born and raised in Mississippi. My mother was born in a very early part, 1900s. She grew up in Mississippi. From her heritage, her grandfather on her father's side was a colonel in the Civil War. He owned slaves. My mother's side, her grandparents, great-grandparents had slaves. So there was very deep family lineage here of Southern history. My mother was raised to be a real Southern woman. She was actually raised in the early 1900s with a black mammy, which is maybe the closest equivalent we could think of, or the women that live in the homes and raise children today. Today we have young women that live in homes and take care of the children and raise them. It's a little different. But at that time, in my mother's childhood, there was a carryover from the very deep South where a black slave would help with the children a lot in the home. And my mother had an elderly black woman who called her Mammy, and she was born in slavery. Of course, slavery had been abolished, but this system still sort of existed where Mammy in the home and helped raise my mother and was really a part of the family. My mother was very close to this person. When my mother went away to college and Mammy died, my mother actually went back home for the services for this person who was very dear to her. So there was a whole history that was involved here. The climate, of course, was the whole reality of segregation and racism. In the Deep South, this fell under what was called the Jim Crow laws, and it was a set of laws that rigidified segregation, where blacks had different bathrooms, blacks had different schools. There were numerous laws that kept black people in an inferior position and kept white people in a superior position. So that was part of the history, part of the climate. Within that, for me, at least in my family, there are two particular aspects. One is a deep human insecurity. In my family, my parents both had very low self-esteem. There was sort of a psychological value of looking down on other people in order to feel a false sense of one's own self-worth. And that was a clear dynamic within my family. A second major dynamic is mythology, and it's how people were taught in those days and still are taught today certain myths about other people that lead to prejudicial action or prejudicial attitudes. In my family, there was a whole set of myths about black people, and our prejudices were generalized not just to black people, but to anybody we thought was, quote, different, which included Jews, Catholics, foreigners, and because of the great pain of the Civil War and Reconstruction, also Northerners. That's probably shocking to a lot of people in our modern world, but I was raised to be prejudiced against Northerners. Within the mythology, some of the attitudes that we had about black people, and these were things that we deeply believed. You believe these like you believe that the sun was out there and existed every day. There was air around you. There was gravity. It was just a part of your world you grew up with. I like to call it almost hereditary. And of course, these things are not hereditary, but these attitudes in my case were passed down from generation to generation. And of course, that doesn't have to come that way, but it's myths people learn about other people that they don't have the opportunity to realize are not true, but they hold in place certain attitudes that affect certain behaviors that are extremely destructive. Within my family, there was the belief that black people were not intelligent. There was the belief that black people would tend to smell bad, and we had elderly black men that worked for my grandfather, so I was around black people some, even though my schools, church, etc. were all white. But if I walked past a black person, I might hold my breath because of the belief that there was going to be some smell that was unique to black people. There was a belief that it was unsafe to be around black people. When my mother and I would drive downtown in Norfolk, Virginia, and see a black person on the street, my mother would automatically lock the car doors. It was just an instinct on her part. There was a belief that black people had certain diseases, certain sexual diseases, that they were unclean and had diseases in general. Norfolk, Virginia wasn't quite as segregated as the deeper South, but it was clearly very, very segregated. My mother certainly had fears of public places where black people might have been. She thought you could get diseases from people, from toilet seats, from doorknobs, etc. So she had a lot of fears around that area. Within this belief of inferiority, we had a couple of maids that worked for us during parts of my life. Our maids had a separate bathroom. My mother would not be comfortable with a black person sharing one of the bathrooms that our family used because fear of disease, cleanliness, etc. So it went that far. And my mother was a very sincere person. She really believed the races should be separate. She believed black people were inferior. She was very maternalistic in that she believed white people had a role of taking care of the black people and that the black race was okay as long as they were in their place, which of course was a very inferior place. And I remember one time my mother asked our maid Mary, this was during the civil rights time period, I was sitting in the kitchen, my mom turned to Mary and totally sincerely, she said, "Mary, colored children don't want to go to school, white children, do they?" And you know, what's Mary going to say to the person who employs her, of course, but "No, ma'am, Miss Drake." My mom did that in, perfect innocence, perfect sincerity. So these things were a whole part of our world. For myself, in Norfolk, I went to all white schools. I actually went to private schools. Growing up in the 50s, Prince Edward County in Virginia actually closed their whole school system, the whole county school system, for 5 years in order to avoid integrating. In my hometown of Norfolk, I know some of the schools closed. Grammy High School, I know, was closed, and that was the nearest high school to where I lived. So there was extreme rigidity, extreme fear of integrating, extreme resistance to integration. My mother's belief was that it was communists who were stirring up the trouble. Martin Luther King was a communist. He was one of the rebel rousers, and if he wasn't making all these speeches and the communists weren't doing all these things, things wouldn't really be too bad. So that was the overview. My father was very racist also. He was much harsher than my mom. He would use derogatory names for black people, whereas my mother was too, quote, refined to do that. My mother was a very good-hearted person, very kind person, very deep sense of fairness and justice, which is sounds a little contradictory here, but of course, one's definition of fairness and justice is subjective, and of course, it didn't really extend to black people, but she would not have quite looked at it that way. There's also some people who are what we call racist, and I think everybody has prejudices. I think most all of us have some degree of racism. I remember when my mother died at age 95, about 10 years ago. I remember her telling me one time, William, we really weren't racist. You just don't understand. And that was where she came from. You just don't understand that black people are inferior, and there are these certain laws you have to enforce, and certain things that are important to protect the integrity of the races, et cetera, et cetera. In closing my section of this, I'd like to read 2 poems that I wrote, which to me capture some of what I'm talking about. And then Lou, to me, it was really neat to meet Lou about a month or 2 ago. Lou, it's a little hard to tell on the radio, but he's a black guy. I'm a white guy. You probably figured that out. And what's fascinating to me is Lou grew up about 15 miles from me at the exact same time period in a black neighborhood, and has the other half of this experience I'm talking about. So personally, I look forward to hearing Lou talk about his experience. But I'm going to read 2 poems here that I wrote about 12 years ago. One of them is about my mother. It's called Mama Don't Know. Mama don't know that black folks don't all have unmentionable antisocial diseases. Mama don't know that black men aren't muggers and rapists. Mama don't know that General Powell's intelligence isn't from some white ancestor. Mama don't know that black mammies should have been home with their own babies from the get-go. Mama don't know that the kindest of slave owners wasn't kind. Mama don't know that her great-grandmother's Negro property of 200 human beings kept their owner in bondage, too. My mama, she got a bad memory. She never learned to forget what her mama thought she knew.